Hello, very beautiful community. How are you? I think at the moment we have, for the Europeans, a return to yet another reckoning with the question of whether Putin is going to stop unless he's stopped. And I can tell you that's never a good thing in politics when your policy options are dependent on a very complex interpretation of history. And it's even harder when your domestic politics is in disarray, when your democracies are in decline, and yet you're trying to collectively engage with other European powers in doing something to support Ukraine and stop Putin that is dependent on big answers to big questions about what it is that Putin is actually going to do next and why. So it's always, a difficult thing when there is too much either metaphysics or historical interpretation that's required for policy formation. Now, the practical options the Europeans are looking for are 2.1-fold. The point one of an option is a US backstop with European troops in Ukraine in some capacity. It's point one because it's a 10% or a 1% scenario, really. I mean, it's really a case of the Europeans pushing for something that they're overwhelmingly likely not to get, a significant US backstop. Why are they pushing for it? Well, they're pushing for it because the other two options are very difficult. The other two options are European troops in Ukraine without a US backstop, which raises extraordinarily, arguably insuperable practical questions and military questions, which I'm not qualified to talk about in terms of what these troops cannot do without American backing, in terms of rules of engagement, in terms of interoperability. It also raises enormous political questions because European populations that are drifting ideologically closer to Putin. And remember how I've been saying that if you've been with me for a long time, been saying something that's really been confronting for a lot of people, and that is that Putin will become more popular in the West, among Western populations, as time goes on. I've been saying that right from 2022. Not a strange view. Funnily enough, somebody who has, from an activist perspective, actually shared that view in our bubble is Jake, our friend Jake Bro. So it's a view that really I haven't changed, because that's where the direction of drift is going. So it's going to be a nearly impossible situation for the Europeans domestically if their troops get killed in Ukraine, especially in some kind of indirect way with plausible deniability for the Russians. So they're looking at these three options at the moment, right? Pushing for a US backstop, thinking about, the almost undoable scenario of European troops there without a US backstop, and then thinking about just no European troops, just backing Ukraine financially, militarily, and so on. But all of that is happening against the backdrop of a very important question, and that's that, will we have a situation where Europe has to fight Putin anyway? And that's a very difficult question. The answer to that question, unfortunately, informs policy. We know that one of the remarkable things, in the sense that it's remarkable because of how clear it was, one of the remarkable things about the Biden administration's early response, and this was very much something that Biden personally shared as a perspective, was that you shouldn't interpret what Putin is doing, right? What Biden said right at the beginning of the war, and we have enough sources to reconstruct this, is let's not try to have a theory of what Putin is doing because we could get it wrong. Let's be agnostic about why he's doing what he's doing, and then we can react. So this interpretation of the question of whether Putin's going to stop unless he is stopped was sort of intentionally suspended by the Biden administration. We'll support Ukraine, as long as we can, quote unquote, and then see what happens, while also making sure we don't support Ukraine too much to mitigate both nuclear risk above all, and secondly, some kind of domestic collapse in Russia, which is very much a thing that US policy wanted to avoid. But now that question is back, because you can't really have clarity about what policy Europe should try to push for, likely or unlikely, without having a sense of this. So let's say a few words about this. It's important, as Greg Udin does, to actually lean back on the pre-full-scale invasion Putin ultimatum, the substance of which is really a request for the dissolution of NATO and a kind of a clearing out of NATO from Eastern Europe. So what you want to say about that is that Putin has no proprietorial attitude to France or the UK or Italy. But he thinks that he does have some proprietorial claim on Eastern Europe. There is a sense in which the Baltics and Moldova and even Poland are his. Not in the sense that he thinks that they should be part of Russia. He doesn't even think Ukraine should be part of Russia. I mean, he wants political control over Ukraine. He doesn't want Ukraine to be, incorporated into Russia with the other magic wand. He would find that option really challenging. But he thinks that these are countries that have a limited sovereignty, a kind of sovereignty light. The only sovereignty that matters is the sovereignty of great powers. And given that their sovereignty is light, it's not that they belong to Russia, but Russia has more business than the West does, inflecting the fates of these countries. And therefore, if it's the West inflecting the fates of these countries via NATO, something has gone wrong. NATO has overstretched into a kind of historically unnatural predicament. And that's connected to Putin's practical thought that if you nudge military alliances because they're in places they shouldn't be, they will eventually fairly easily retreat. That's what he thinks is happening in Ukraine. There's a kind of an egregious overextension of Western power in Putin's view that is sort of farcically overreaching, because there's just no sense whatever in which Ukraine is American, but he thinks that all the trends in Ukraine, not just toward Western alliances, but toward independence and democratization, they are all in fact just projections of US imperial power. So keep in mind this proprietorial story in relation to the pre-war ultimatum. And then when we talk about the motivations of the Putin regime, we get to two things. We get to a mythology of escalation against the West, that I think is the second biggest cause of the war. And that's some rather mystical vision, and I won't let go of that word, to rearrange global affairs and project Russia from the back row to the front row of nations in a sort of a single zigzag-like swoop. And the main reason for war is regime security. Putin needs X to keep his regime secure, and especially make sure that it's secure when things get rocky. So what is X? Is X escalation? Is X war? Now you might say Putin needs Ukraine to make sure that when Putin's regime is rocky, that at that point Ukraine isn't independent, because that would be enormously destabilizing for Russia. And that's sort of his nightmare Gaddafi predicament. And that's why, right? We don't want to say that NATO expansion isn't part of the causes of war, because we don't want to put things at zero. But Putin's problem is, I would say, more not with NATO expansion, but with NATO existence, and with the very idea of Ukraine being independent. An independent Ukraine is still an existential threat to Putin, and an existential threat to his life as he perceives it, because it could sort of increase the chances of him suffering a Gaddafi scenario if things go wrong for him. Now, if Putin ceases to engage in foreign escalation or war, this is simply going to multiply political conflict between various elites in Russia, and as a consequence of that, progressively reduce Putin's power in the country. So a reconcentration of power into his own hands, done in an abrupt way and in a dangerous way, in a way that at least it seemed like for a while would make it be true that Putin grabbed extra power for himself, but his hold over it became more vulnerable. So that events in 2023, the Prigozhin mutiny. But that sustenance of concentrated power in Putin's hands is predicated on a degree of foreign escalation. Now, experts disagree about what extent of foreign escalation we're talking about. I am inclined to draw that line closer to war. So I take a sort of a more moderately alarmist position on this. Somebody like Mark Galeotti, and I'll stick the video where I sort of intentionally platform Mark's views because they're somewhat different from mine on the main channel, because it's really important to hear them. Mark Galeotti would represent the camp of experts who think that Putin is fighting a regime security war, but his regime security is dependent on foreign escalation that's short of war. And that's a big difference. And it's a difference that's absolutely going to affect what view of it you take, is absolutely going to affect what you should do, right, if you're a European leader. There is another scenario whereby you could make the case that Putin could minimize the dependence on war and even foreign escalation if he started something more like a war domestically against particular minority groups. There are very important regime security questions for Putin to do with the extent of politicization and depoliticization of the population. Putin has been balancing politicization with depoliticization, drifting toward needing to politicize the population more, while knowing that's not entirely in his control, and going about it slowly. Now, before Trump, my view, which is expressed in the main channel video about will Putin have a conflict with NATO, before 2030, was that we were on balance going to slide past a conflict with Putin if we had to bet on it, because history intervenes. History is complex. All kinds of unexpected things happen. And even if there is a default trajectory towards something like Putin challenging Article 5, which I think there has been, history can throw a few spikes in the wheel of that, and thereby we skip it. And I thought on balance we were going to skip it. So my view of Putin challenging Article 5 before Trump was, we're trending there. It's a coin toss leaning toward we'll skip it, historically. Trump changes nothing except as an accelerator of Western decline. When you're in decline, you're more likely to generate new political forces that accelerate that decline, and so on. It's a self-perpetuating circle. Now, Putin's view of our decline is false, because he views it as itself a kind of an almost historical law that we collapse in the West as a coherent force able to act on the international stage, because democracy does not exist. Right? That's a false account. Democracy exists, but it's weakening. So this Trumpian acceleration means that we do need to somewhat accelerate our own thinking about how this question of Putin challenging NATO stands, because it is NATO itself that is dissolving right now without much help from Putin. And Article 5 is largely non-functional now. And so what that means is that we now are strongly considering the scenario that Putin may have less need to project Russia from the back row to the front row of nations via some kind of challenge to NATO that dissolves NATO, puts NATO in a difficult position, and sort of facilitates a non-reaction from NATO that makes the alliance no longer viable. There's less need for Putin to do that now if NATO's decline is accelerated without him doing anything. So there's a situation of there being no West for the Putin to challenge anymore. And as Dugin has said recently, right, if you have enough post-truth authoritarian populists in power in Western countries, they may view Russia as an ideological ally and may not see Russian elections as unfree, in verbatim Dugin's language. And he's right. But what does remain are Putin's regime security needs, which are predicated on a certain kind of a mobilization for a big confrontation with the West, whatever the shape of the West. So this is really difficult. Right? You see, these are difficult waters in which to form judgments, and yet the European response is dependent on this. If Starmer and Macron got a piece of paper which said, look, there's a guarantee that whatever happens in Ukraine, that Putin stops there and there's going to be nothing else happening after, that would change their policy. That would change the way they think in the way they speak in private, at least, very strongly. So we can't get out of this question of what are the odds that we'll be in a confrontation with Putin of some kind anyway. And if we think the answer to that is yes, then it makes much more sense to just risk that confrontation in Ukraine. And if the answer to that is no, it makes much more sense to not risk that confrontation in Ukraine for European powers. So we're in a difficult moment where Europe is hyperactive, where Europe is pushing for a scenario that is unlikely to realize with the US backstop, and where Europe at the same time, while readjusting, needs to take a serious view of the actual causes of war, right? And the actual, not biographical, but structural motivation of the Putin regime. What is it going to be inclined to do, given the various pressures it is under and given the various conceptions and ideological pictures that obtain in it? So that's enough. Lots of things thrown on the canvas. I hope it doesn't look simply like a canvas full of sort of meaningless splashes. But it's important for us to keep returning to that canvas because it does lie at the heart of what we are going to have to sort of make, how we're going to analyze the European actions today. Lots of love.